again, to stress that our work is fundamentally in developing risk assessment methodologies, is to evaluate at the planning phase how to recognize risk, how to document risk, how to communicate risk. And of course, your project may well be that you can avoid it, you can mitigate it, you can transfer it, you can accept it. Typically, I hear quotes when I run workshops, and I think we've had around about 10,000 people through our workshops over the years. I've been doing these for 20 years or so, and literally around the world, with classes typically between 20 and 50 at a time. I'll hear quotes like this: "Oh, we got a specialist contractor that does our risk assessment," or "Oh, we've got lots of experience in events, so we just do the minimal on risk assessment because we know how to keep it safe." And no one reads the risk assessment. Well, why bother? And what concerned me when I was doing some research in this area was information. Now, information theory by Shannon, which is in telecommunications and in mathematics for encryption and compression programs, is that when you take information and you reproduce it by transmitting it, so you compress it, transmit it, decompress it, then the problem that always with graphics of getting information across telecommunications is loss. So how much information is lost in the process. So you may have seen some images that you get through the internet that are a bit granular. That's because they are compressed and decompressed, and you lose a bit of detail along the way. So let's consider our risk assessment process. Information is first visualized, is anticipated, and then documented. And you have in the box a few lines that you can put a description, and then you put a value against it, the likelihood versus consequence. It's written down in that form in a document. And at some point, somebody needs to read that document and decode it back into useful information. The question is how much is lost in the process? Well, let's look at a typical example. This actually, I think, comes from the HSE website. It talks about hazard, trip, slip and fall, person at risk, all at the event, especially the aged or those carrying objects. Your likelihood versus consequence, 4 by 2 equals 8. Measures to control the risk, pre-event check, all cables buried, information about an evening round. Action, Bill Smith, and then the revised risk factor, 2 by 2 equals 4. So here it looks as if we completed it, and of course that's your statutory requirement. But if there's an incident, let's look at how it might be interpreted. Hazard, trip, slip and fall. Have you identified where you might have a higher risk of trip, slip and fall? Is it consistent across the entire site? If there's a crowd in an area, is the risk of a trip, slip and fall and the consequence of a trip, slip and fall in an overcrowded space greater or less than it would be in an area which had less pedestrian footfall? So you haven't actually defined the hazard clearly at all. Person at risk, all at the event, especially the aged or those carrying objects. Well, I'm now 60. Am I aged? What is the definition of aged? What is an object? How does one carry an object? Could one have a higher risk of carrying, say, a pencil or, a larger weight? So you haven't defined the age, you haven't defined the nature of the object, you haven't defined the nature of carrying. 4 by 2 times 8 is 4 times 2 equals 8 is absolutely correct mathematically if you're working to base 10, but we won't get into those details. But let's have a look at the measures to control the risk. Pre-event check to remove loose material and level uneven ground. What do you define as loose material? Remove it to where? At what level should the ground be? Is this micrometer flat, or are you allowed a 1-inch step or a gap in it? What do you mean by uneven, and what do you mean by level? All cables buried or at eye level seems to make a lot of sense. Yeah, put them below the ground or above head height. And then information about uneven ground and correct footwear is not even a whole sentence. What information? Where should it be presented? What type of uneven ground? How do you define this? And what do you mean by correct footwear? So Bill's job could be to look at old people carrying objects and make sure that they wear sensible shoes. And you see how open this is to interpretation. And that's your document. That's your defence in a court of law, your risk assessment. And if you have failed to document your risk assessment, or there's evidence of cut and paste from previous risk assessment, in other words, you've done a sloppy job, clearly the finger or the arrow of justice points more towards negligence than it does towards taking reasonable care. So that's why we developed these 4 core tools in crowd science. The DMICE risk analysis model, that's based on causality of accidents and incidents from a legal perspective. We looked at influences of crowd behaviour and phases of crowd behaviour, both under normal and emergency situations. We developed ramp analysis, crowd dynamics, routes, area, movement and profile of people, risk and congestion mapping, and these are all tools to analyse risk from different perspectives. And the decision support model, both strategic and tactical analysis. Coupled with that, of course, is the understanding of crowd density and crowd flow. Our decision support tools here designed as a rapid lookup for your dynamic risk analysis in the control room. So let's break it down and have a look at these particular tools. They form a suite of tools, and they were designed as an integrated suite. And I've often seen people who will take elements of a model and bastardize it and change it or add bits to it without fundamentally understanding the whole purpose of this is a suite of tools. It's not just one tool in isolation. You can't pick and choose, I'll have that element because it happens to work for my environment. These all work together as an integrated approach for your planning phases. So the dim ice model was actually designed to collect and collate information from different authorities. When I worked out in Saudi back in 2000 or so, I realised that we had concrete engineers, designers, structural designers. We had management teams, which were the Army, Civil Defence, General Security, and then there was a Ministry of Hajj, the scheduling. So design, information and management were the three fundamental groups there, and they all had different approaches to analysing the problems, and they had different perspectives of risk. So by putting it into one table, I was able to take different opinions and collect and collate them together. Now, I've seen some people try to add additional elements to this, but not really understanding that the model was designed as both a macro and a microscopic view. And I'll show you examples of that later. I can compare and contrast events with it. So the whole emphasis on this is to look at two different crowds in the same venue. What are the different risk assessments associated with that? And to develop a very rapid method of collecting and collating information so that you can then pass it on, areas for communication for improvement. Now, the whole aim to this was to standardise event planning, license and operations. I've seen a lot of people use the dim ice model in a licensing perspective as a checklist. Have you considered the following things? So different formats of event plans can be quickly assessed to make sure that they fulfill all 18 categories that are within this particular model. Now, again, this definition of stampedes, the word is very emotive and incorrectly used. And again, my colleagues will probably argue this particular point a lot more vehemently. But Shubhi Khemani, and I've done a lot of work recently out in India working with the police there in terms of planning for major events. But he's identified a failure to put in a crowd management plan and a failure to accommodate the behavioural aspects of the crowd. So these are these two primary failure points. And to understand crowd dynamics in this context, no crowd management plan, poor understanding of crowd behaviour. So the development of the dim ice model, based on the research of accidents and incidents, is to try and identify the primary influences on crowd behaviour. How do we make the crowd do the things that are going to keep them safe? We need to understand the design, we need to understand their information environment, we need to understand our management processes and procedures. We also need to understand that there are three primary phases of crowd behaviour: ingress, circulation and egress. They come in with a set of expectations and understanding, they move around, and then they leave. And of course, crowd behaviour is different in each of these three phases. So we need to understand how the phases and influence put together. And of course, this started to look extremely complicated until you think with a mathematical model in mind. And that's it. The dim ice model allows you to fill in each of those boxes with a brief description and to identify the fact that an emergency during ingress is a very different situation to a mid-event emergency. Typically, event plans will just basically state, the event of an emergency, we stop the event and everybody leaves in an orderly manner, or words to that effect. But most of the accidents and incidents occur during ingress and during egress. So your event plan has to have an emergency during ingress, a mid-event emergency, and an emergency during egress. And unless it does, it's not fit for its intended purpose. Now, by filling in the table, we start to think about the three different phases and the three different influences, both under normal and emergency phases, influences, and modes of behaviour. Now, of course, you can extrapolate more and more information onto it, but the fundamentals here are based on the causal elements and the history of accidents and incidents. And it's a three-table model because it has three dimensions to it. Now, we explain this in the master's program when we look at catastrophe theory and how to recognize the early stages of an incident going wrong, red flagging it, and where to push it, what to do in order to put it back into a safe environment. You can only do that if you've got a 3-axis model. You can't visualize more than 3 dimensions. So think of a surface and think about how we can use that. It's a topic that we do cover in depth in our master's program, but the fundamentals of that are based in the dim ice model. And the students that we've been working with, I think we have over 50 master students at the moment, appreciate those fundamental differences, that yes, you can enhance models and have additional columns on here, but then it doesn't allow you to look at catastrophe theory and look at how we might manage environments away from safety. Why this is so important: emergency during egress. Well, Falls Festival, which is a recent class action suit. I was expert witness for the prosecution on that one. Crowd crush during egress, narrow point on the system where the volume exceeded the capacity. 60 people were injured, 19 seriously. Now, the whole criterion for any legal case is it reasonably foreseeable that something of this nature could happen? If the risk is predictable, then the accident is preventable. And here again, we have a similar situation. The crowds move in over a longer period of time, but as they move out over a very short period of time, then the pressure on those exits increase. And you see here the characteristics of a major incident, here 60 people injured, are very, very similar. Is that they may come in at one rate, but they leave at a different rate. And if this was an emergency situation, then of course people would be trying to leave in a much more anxious manner. Now, the various class action suit here was brought. It could be a multi-million-dollar bill for a crowd crush, and that's why safety is so important. It won't ever make profit if you sit and try and justify a safety case. It's an insurance policy. What you're trying to do is prevent the move towards a negligence rather than this reasonable foreseeable criterion here is, can I demonstrate that it was reasonably foreseeable and a competent person would not have laid that particular event out in that way? That's your criterion that I generally apply to it. Is it reasonably foreseeable that X, Y, Z would happen? The other criterion is what's called the but-for test. But for that barrier in that place, this crowd would have moved out of those areas. But for a crowd management plan. But for, and if you can demonstrate that a reasonable, foreseeable or a layperson could have seen with the right lens, the right filter, that something was going to go wrong, then of course that's the difference between an accident and an accident caused by negligence. And that's where most of the cases revolve around those definitions. So the dim ice model here, basically you put a brief note in each. I've seen some of my students make the mistake of trying to write an entire event plan in these. It's not. It's a microscopic view of sections of a site. Brief description, so this might be an ingress or an egress point, and how the crowds are approaching it, what happens when they're moving through it, and what happens when they're moving in the opposite direction. So if we look at a site like Parliament Square in Ottawa, there we see a dim ice model being applied to different sections of the site. So it was very important to understand where our limitations exist, and that the model here allows us to look at microscopic elements. Now, see when people add last mile to it, which might be fine for an event plan that deals with a fixed structure, a stadia, where you've got a big transport infrastructure. It doesn't lend itself to breaking it down for individual components. So the dim ice, again, looks at points of failure, modes and influences of crowd behaviour, and how the phases change. So influences, phases and modes of behaviour are all encapsulated in that model because it's been based on causality in the legal context. Now, here was a situation where we recognised that we couldn't alter the architectural aspect of the site. We wanted to get 30 to 50,000 people in and out the site, and there had been crushes because that's the narrowest point in the system. And it's very much like the children's story. You can't go, they're going for a bear hunt. You can't go through it, you can't go under it, you can't go around it, but you can go over it. Now, this actually required an Act of Parliament to extend Wellington Street to be part of a parliamentary area, because the police in Ottawa are not allowed to stop and search individuals in public rights of way, so on the streets. but the parliamentary services can stop and search before you come into the event space. So by alleviating this problem, namely we've now got a significant amount of throughput on and off the site, we now need to put new search cordons into place, particularly when we've got VIPs arriving. So that meant that Wellington Street could become a search area, but that meant that it had to be part of the parliamentary square, which meant that they needed an active parliament to extend its boundary for the duration of that event. So here we see we ran a workshop with the group 2017 for the 150th anniversary. We advised that the queuing system needed this. They decided no, they knew better. It was not working well, and then we were asked in 2018 to get to grips with it and redesign the thing. And this was just one of our projects that we're involved in. So there we see Parliament Square extended onto Wellington Street. And now we've got a much larger footprint, a much safer environment. And this was applying the dim ice model to separate sections of the site. So there's an example of how we use it. Not trying to get the whole event in one model, but breaking it up into separate sections. Red, amber, green on your dim ice model, because red is stuff that we need to improve for the future. Amber is stuff we need to monitor in the day. Green is stuff that we think we do well and never really need to scrutinise or question. Generally, it's the green I look at first.